binding while you are doing the long arming process, it's really very simple. You need to find center of your binding. So you want to prepare it first. And this is just standard 2.5-inch strips sewn together end to end. And I hold the two ends together and then kind of run it through my hands to find center. And you want to do your first pass of long arm stitching first, so that anything that's going to go off the edge already has, and you have the sides of the quilt already stitched down. And you're just going to attach it like you would normally. I have this is like a bungee cord with toggles on it, and I mark center and the two sides, and so that helps me. And it doesn't have to be exact, it needs to be approximate. I used a quilt calculator to figure out how many strips I need, and then I'm just going to pin it on like I would, any other binding. Just going to pin it on with quilt pins, regular quilting pins, not long arming pins. So you want to keep it pretty flat. You don't want any bubbles. And I'm just pinning it every 6 to 8 inches or so. Now the downside of doing this way is that, and it may not matter to you. It might, but it might not. And if it doesn't, and in this case it doesn't to me, because this particular quilt is just something that's gonna go in my living room. Not that big of a deal. I would not do this for a show quilt, obviously, because the reason being, when you go to make your 90-degree miter right here, it's not going to miter the same direction all the way around on the quilt, just by virtue of the fact that it is being folded from opposite directions. And if that's not clear, if you ever do this, like say you're doing it on a wall hanging or something, that'll make sense once you start to do it like that. And what I do is I take this last pin and I put it approximately 1/4 of an inch away from the end here. And that's where I will stop. And I turn the pin the opposite direction so I know that that's my stop. And then I'm going to do it the other way down here. And when you get to the final part on the bottom of the quilt, you want to stop about 12 inches apart, 10 to 12 inches apart, and give yourself enough room to finish, put the binding strips together. Okay, and then you're going to take your binding strips and lay them off to the side and let them hang over the edge for now. And what I do is I will start in the middle and work my way out, just like when I stitched this on. When I stitch my tops on, when I do the first stitch, I start in the middle and work my way out, and that just seems to work pretty well for me. When I do this, I don't put my channel locks on, because just like when you're stitching a regular, doing it the regular way, you may or may not be totally and perfectly straight. So I want to make sure that I can see into the back, because I want to be far enough in. And so I'm going to put the back of the foot on the edge of the binding. Pull up my bobbin thread, do a tie off, and then I'm just going to press the green button and go. You see how much faster this is. Very recoverable. If you don't make it straight, you can back up in the seam allowance and go again. All right, now that I'm here at the end, I'm going to remove this pin and tie off, just like I would doing a regular binding. And I'm going to come forward and I want to pull up my bobbin thread. All right, and then just like a regular binding, you're going to lay it back so that the edge of the binding is even with the edge of the quilt. Get it a nice flat triangle and then fold it down. It may be helpful to take a pin and put the pin on the edge of the binding and then fold it over, and that will keep you nice and straight. And use that pin to make sure everything stays. And then I like to start down just a little bit, bring up my bobbin thread. You don't want to take your stitching of your binding any farther down than about 1/2 inch to the end of your last row of stitching, so that if it were down like this and there was going to be a nest, it would catch up in there. So then you want to take your binding and take a pin and just kind of pin it up out of the way and make sure that any nesting that occurs is not going to cause a problem. With the tail of the binding pinned out of the way, I have nested my pattern, and it looks like everything is going to stitch out just fine and not get caught in the binding anywhere. All right, here we go. Okay, get down to the end of the quilt, and I'm just going to finish this up. Again, I have marked 1/4 inch away from the end. And if you're not comfortable with doing this freehand, you can always use a straight ruler, a quilting ruler, and just pull it down the edge. Mark your seam line if you want with like a friction marker, anything like that, that's fine. So again, put that out to a 90, fold it over my fingers. So now I've got to go this direction. Sew off and sew back. And I have marked a pin down here where I want to stop. Okay, now that I've got the binding on, I am going to trim the quilt here. This makes life so much easier, than having to try to trim it and find a big flat surface. So what I do is I'm going to leave this to give me tension on each side, and I'm just going to trim up the sides and be careful not to cut into the binding. I'm just going to trim right next to the binding. pieces, my goodness. So, within minutes of finishing the quilt, it has been trimmed off the backing and the binding is already on. So, okay, to finish the diagonal seam, I go over to my straight stitch machine and I'm just gonna, here's that, I don't know, 10, 12 inch opening, and I have both tails right here. And I'm just going to, I need to give myself enough to work with to lay this piece on my left out flat. You can do this from either side, it doesn't matter. But I just want it to be able to, about halfway between the opening. Y'all, there's no math here. So halfway, I'm just going to cut this and just trim it straight up and lay that down. Now, what I do is I take this strip end and open it up, and essentially it gives you a 2.5 inch measuring guide. Let me move the quilt a little bit. I have my knee lift on here, that's how I lifted that up. So I'm going to lay this out flat, making sure the edges align. And you can tell it's not cut straight, it doesn't matter. Now with this piece, what I'm going to do is lay it over the top, exactly, and then about halfway through the opening, just lay this down flat, trim it, and this is your measuring guide right here. Set these edges up exactly like this. Lay this over, and not right on it. I'm going to move in about 1/8 of an inch. This is a 1/4 inch ruler right here. So I'm going to come in about 1/8 of an inch. And then I'm going to make a line with my friction pen. That's my measurement. Again, no math. And then you want to trim this on your line. Okay, so this is all scrap. Now to do this, the one that was on the bottom, open it up flat, and the one that was on the top, essentially it'll be a 360-degree turn. If you're looking at the back side of the fabric, wrong side of the fabric, flip it toward you, 360. Okay. And then you want to match these corners up perfectly. That little 1/8 of an inch will take up the slack there. And then I'm going to put a pin in the corner, and you want to match these edges up and match your top edges up. I'm going to put another pin. And, you know, just as a guide if you want, where that corner is right there, just make a mark. Gives you something to aim for. If you want to draw your line, you can. It can be kind of fiddly, but that's okay. I like to use my presser foot as a third hand here. So you want to draw your line. I'll do it from this side. Draw your line from corner to corner. I have diagonal seam tape on the bed of my machine, so I don't have to do this. But if you want to, you can. If it makes you feel better to do that. Okay? There's my sew line. You want to sew directly on that line, not a 1/4 inch on either side of it. Okay? So now, if If you need to use a leader or ender, go ahead and do that. I don't, because I have a single hole. I'm going to sew directly on that line. I'm going to pull it this way so you can see. All right. Take my pins out. And then if we pull it flat, you can tell it's going to fit just perfect. Every time it fits just perfect. So now I'm going to trim this with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, approximately. Don't cut it until you pull it flat and make sure it's going to fit. And you've got the sides right, the right direction. That looks great. Okay. I'm going to finger crease or finger press this little seam there. That's great. Okay. And I'm going to start about 3 or 4 stitches away. So I stitch over my old ones. Back stitch. All done. Look at that. It lays perfectly flat. That little 1/8 of an inch really makes a difference to keep little bubbles out or any kind of problems you might have come up. So, all right, this is ready to be ironed. I'm going to iron it flat and fold it over and stitch it on. That's it. I hope that was helpful. Thanks for watching. Please give a thumbs up or subscribe. Okay, guys, that's it. Thanks for watching. Go sew something.